Sophie closed her eyes and took a deep breath of the aroma of coffee. Her morning ritual helped her get ready for the workday. Jacob, her husband, had been leaving for work before her for months now, supposedly because of important meetings with clients. They used to always have breakfast together. They met 10 years ago in Riverside Park. Sophie was rollerblading and crashed into Jacob, who was reading a book on a bench. He didn't get angry but laughed and helped her up. A week later, they met again in the same park. She was skating more carefully, and he was pretending to read on the same bench. Jacob was working as an assistant sales manager at a small company, and Sophie had just graduated from college. He won her over with his ability to find a way out of any situation and his unique sense of humor, a little cynical but not mean. She attracted him with her spontaneity and zest for life. Their romance developed rapidly. 6 months later, they moved in together, and a year later, they were married. They spent their honeymoon traveling around Europe, spending all their savings, but it was worth it. Jacob photographed her in front of famous landmarks. They ate croissants in small Parisian cafes and rode gondolas in Venice. When they returned, they threw themselves into their work. Jacob quickly climbed the career ladder, and Sophie got a job as an event coordinator at a large company. She loved her job. Organizing conferences, team-building events, and corporate parties required attention to detail and good people skills. The first 5 years of marriage were almost perfect. They supported each other, made plans, and saved up for their own home. On weekends, they would go on trips out of town or go to the theater. Jacob would give her small gifts for no reason, a book she wanted to read or an unusual brooch from a flea market. But gradually, something began to change. Jacob started staying late at work more often and became irritable. Their conversations boiled down to discussing everyday issues. He stopped hugging her in the morning and kissing her before bed. Sophie tried to talk to him, but he dismissed her. Too much work, an important project, difficult clients. She tried to understand him. Indeed, the workload at the company had increased over the past year. Jacob was now responsible for key clients. But it wasn't just about work. He seemed emotionally distant, as if he had built an invisible wall between them. Sophie crossed the kitchen and put her cup in the sink. Her gaze fell on a magnet she had brought back from her honeymoon, the Colosseum against the sunset. She remembered how she and Jacob had wandered through the streets of Rome, holding hands. Back then, it seemed that their love could overcome any obstacle. Her phone vibrated, a message from her assistant reminding her of an upcoming meeting. Sophie sighed and began to get ready for work. Lately, she had found herself thinking more and more that their marriage had become a habit. She and Jacob seemed to be moving along parallel paths, occasionally intersecting in the space of their shared apartment. Maybe they should have had a child. The thought sometimes crossed her mind. But Jacob always avoided the subject, saying that now was not the time, that they needed to get financially stable first. Although they had enough money, he earned well, and her salary was decent. Throwing on her coat, Sophie caught her reflection in the mirror. She hadn't changed much over the years. The same expressive brown eyes, the same dark hair down to her shoulders. Only her gaze had changed. It was more wary, as if she was constantly expecting something. On her way to work, she wondered when exactly the problems had started. Maybe it was 6 months ago when Jacob didn't show up for her birthday for the first time, citing an important meeting with investors. Or earlier, when he stopped talking about his plans and dreams. Parking at the office, Sophie decided that she would definitely talk to her husband that evening. She couldn't let their relationship turn into a mere formality. She loved Jacob and believed that he loved her too. They just needed to find a way to get closer to each other again. It didn't even occur to Sophie that her husband could have an affair. Jacob wasn't that kind of man. She knew him like the back of her hand. At least, that's what she thought. The Sterling Industries office was bustling with activity. A new division was set to open in 2 weeks, and Sophie was immersed in organizing the presentation. She was methodically reviewing the guest list when her assistant, Abigail Stone, popped into her office. "Sophie, the architects sent an updated floor plan. They say we'll have to move the buffet tables because there isn't enough room in the lobby due to a new installation," Abigail said, placing a folder with drawings on the desk. Sophie rubbed her temples. In her 8 years with the company, she had learned to solve problems like this on autopilot. She had started out as a simple administrator whose duties included serving coffee and photocopying documents. But after only 6 months, she was entrusted with organizing a small corporate event. The event was so successful that management took notice of her. "Show me the old plan," Sophie said, unfolding the drawings. A few minutes later, a solution was found. All they had to do was move the information stand slightly. Abigail nodded admiringly. She was still amazed at her boss's ability to find elegant solutions to the most complicated situations. The phone on the desk rang. It was the printing company. There were problems with printing the presentation booklets. Sophie habitually put the phone on speaker while glancing at the event budget on her computer screen. "Listen, Mr. Donovan." Her voice sounded calm and confident. "The contract clearly states the deadlines. If you can't make it, I'll have to find another printer. We have contacts with a dozen companies that would be happy to take on this order." After a minute of negotiations, the problem was solved. The booklets would be delivered on time. Abigail, still in the office, watched her boss with a smile. She had once dreamed of learning to be as tough as her. Sophie leaned back in her chair, remembering her journey at the company. After her first successful event, she took up self-study, learning about trends in event planning, management psychology, and the basics of design. Her career took off. First, she was promoted to junior organizer, then to lead specialist. The breakthrough came 3 years ago when she organized a conference for IT specialists. Then everything went wrong. The day before the event, the keynote speaker broke his leg, and the catering company canceled the delivery. Sophie didn't sleep all night, but she found a replacement speaker and negotiated with another contractor. The conference was a huge success, and she was promoted to department head. "Abigail, contact the designers and ask them to send some stage design options." Sophie opened her diary and looked through her list of tasks for the day. She had a meeting with representatives of a partner company, the opening ceremony schedule to finalize, and a dozen other small but important tasks. There was a knock at the door. The courier had delivered samples of handouts. Sophie scrutinized the print quality and paper thickness. Every little detail mattered. She had learned that over the years. Reputation was built on details, and one oversight could ruin months of preparation. She often stayed late at the office before important events. Jacob used to complain about it, but then he got used to it. Lately, he himself was rarely home in the evenings. Sophie pushed the unwelcome thoughts aside. Now, she needed to focus on work. Before lunch, there was a video conference with the European office to discuss the details of foreign partners' participation in the presentation. Sophie easily switched to English, coordinating the actions of teams from different countries. During her time at Sterling Industries, she had significantly improved her language skills, which was necessary for communicating with international clients. After lunch, Sophie went down to the lobby, where workers were assembling structures for a future installation. She carefully examined each element and made several comments. Employees passing by greeted her. She knew almost everyone in the company by name, from the cleaners to the top managers. Back in her office, Sophie started checking the list of contractors. She had personally selected each company based on previous experience. Her phone contained the contacts of the best catering services, decorators, technicians, and photographers in the city. She knew how to find common ground with even the most capricious contractors and achieve perfect results. By the end of the workday, her head was buzzing from the number of issues she had resolved. Sophie walked over to the window and looked out at the city in the evening. She loved this time of day, when the lights of the skyscrapers came on. Somewhere out there, in one of those offices, Jacob was working. I wonder if he thinks about her as often as she thinks about him. Abigail popped into the office to say goodbye. Sophie smiled. She remembered being just as energetic and enthusiastic when she first started her career. Now, experience and confidence had been added to her enthusiasm. She knew she could handle any task. As she gathered her things, Sophie thought about the future. There were rumors in the company about the creation of a new development department, and she was seriously considering applying for the position of head. It would be a big step forward, more responsibility, higher pay, new opportunities. Her phone vibrated in her bag. A message from Jacob. He was running late again. Sophie sighed. Maybe it was a good thing she was so busy at work. At least she didn't have to spend her evenings alone. "She looks promising," remarked Henry Foster, head of customer service, as he reviewed Melissa Harper's resume. The young woman sat across from him, impeccably dressed in a dark blue suit, watching his reaction closely. "Your experience in Chicago is impressive. Why did you decide to move to our city?" Henry leaned back in his chair, studying his potential employee. Her dark hair was pulled back into a strict bun. Her makeup was barely noticeable but emphasized her regular features. "I was looking for new opportunities for growth." Melissa leaned forward slightly. "I had reached a ceiling at my previous company. Sterling Industries is known for its policy of promoting talented employees." Henry noted her confidence, not a hint of doubt or awkwardness. People like that either rise quickly through the ranks or cause problems, but the department needed strong specialists, and her references were impeccable. A week later, Melissa was already working in the sales department's open plan office. Her desk was by the window. She had specifically requested this when she was being assigned her workspace. Her colleagues glanced at the newcomer with interest, but she didn't seem to notice, methodically arranging her stationery. By the end of her first month, Melissa already knew the names of all the key figures in the company and the history of their career growth. She knew how to listen, ask the right questions, and remember details. At corporate meetings, she always sat so she could see the reactions of management and took notes in a small notebook. "Melissa, come in." Henry Foster's voice interrupted her thoughts on the quarterly report. In his office, she was as confident as she had been during the interview. "Your monthly performance is above average. Keep up the good work." That evening, she stayed late at the office, analyzing the company's structure. Names, arrows, and notes appeared on the sheet of paper. She wanted to understand exactly who made the key decisions and who was responsible for promotions. In the smoking room, where Melissa sometimes went, although she didn't smoke, she caught snippets of conversation. She learned that the CFO's wife was flirting with a young lawyer, that the chief accountant had a drinking problem, and that the head of the marketing department was getting divorced. One morning, she ran into Jacob Wilson in the elevator. He nodded absently, immersed in a phone conversation. Melissa glanced at him attentively, a senior sales manager with excellent performance reviews and popular among his colleagues. She had heard that he was being considered for the position of deputy sales director. The next day, she accidentally found herself next to him in line at the corporate cafeteria. They struck up a conversation about a recent deal with a major client. Melissa asked precise questions, demonstrating genuine interest and a deep understanding of the subject. "It's amazing how quickly she's fit in," remarked the director's secretary, watching Melissa confidently give a presentation at a staff meeting. She'd only been with the company for 2 months, and she was already speaking in front of senior management. After work, Melissa often stopped by a small bar near the office. Company employees gathered there, making it the perfect place to gather information. She never got drunk, preferring white wine, and listened carefully to the conversations at the neighboring tables. In her rented apartment furnished with minimalist elegance, there was a diary on the table. Every evening she wrote down her observations and plans. Melissa knew exactly what she wanted, to be in a management position in 2 years. She was methodically working toward that goal. She always showed up at work, impeccably dressed. Her strict suits emphasized her slim figure but did not look provocative. She knew how important it was to make the right impression. Her entire appearance spoke of ambition and professionalism. "That was an amazing presentation," Jacob Wilson said, stopping at her desk after another meeting. Melissa smiled, noticing how he leaned his hand on the back of her chair, a little closer than propriety demanded. That evening she spent longer than usual poring over her diary. Her plan needed adjusting. A new opportunity for promotion had arisen. After all, an affair with a married boss was a risky path to take, but with the right approach, it could prove effective. At the company party, Melissa saw Jacob's wife, Sophie Wilson, for the first time. The elegant woman with a tired look coordinated the staff's work, unaware of her husband's furtive glances in Melissa's direction. At home, sorting through her mail, Melissa found an invitation to a charity evening, another opportunity to make useful acquaintances. She had already picked out the perfect dress, expensive enough to make an impression, but not so flashy as to cause gossip. Her phone was filling up with contacts of influential people in the company. She knew how to charm without crossing the line, and everyone thought she was genuinely interested in talking to them. She was building a network of connections that would sooner or later bear fruit. "That girl will go far," Henry Foster remarked to a colleague one day. He had no idea how far Melissa Harper was willing to go to achieve her goals. Friday evening dragged on. Sophie sat in the living room with an unfinished book, the words blurring before her eyes as she checked her phone for the umpteenth time. Jacob was late again. She put the book aside and went to the window. A light rain was falling, blurring the streetlights. She had noticed the faint scent of an unfamiliar perfume a week ago when she was sorting through the laundry basket. It was a subtle but distinctly feminine scent on her husband's shirt collar. Sophie froze, clutching the fabric in her hands, then methodically finished washing the clothes, trying not to think about the possible reasons. The sound of the door opening snapped her out of her memories. Jacob walked in, loosening his tie as he went. He smelled of the cool autumn evening and, once again, that same perfume. He kissed her on the cheek and headed for the shower without even asking how her day had been. "Are you having dinner?" Sophie asked when he came out of the bathroom. Lately, she often found herself watching her husband, trying to catch any changes in his behavior. "No, I had a snack at the office," he said, taking out his laptop and settling down on the sofa. They used to always have dinner together, discussing the day. That morning, Sophie had found a restaurant receipt in his jacket pocket for two at lunchtime. She carefully put the paper back. That day, he had said he was having lunch with a client. For some reason, she didn't ask who the client was. At work, Jacob now often isolated himself to make phone calls. Sophie noticed this by chance when she came to his department to discuss the details of an upcoming event. He was standing by the window at the far end of the corridor, talking quietly and smiling. When he saw his wife, he quickly ended the conversation. Their weekends together were becoming increasingly silent. Jacob constantly checked his phone and answered questions distractedly, as if his thoughts were far away. There was a distant look in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Honey, how about we go to that Italian restaurant this weekend?" Sophie sat down next to him on the sofa. It used to be their favorite place, cozy, with live music in the evenings. "Sorry, I have a meeting with investors on Saturday," he said, without even looking up from his laptop. "Maybe next time." The next time had already been postponed for 3 months. Sophie got up and went to the kitchen, mechanically loading the dishwasher. At work, she could organize events of any complexity, but at home she increasingly felt helpless. She didn't remember the new tie that had appeared in her husband's wardrobe, blue with a subtle geometric pattern, not his usual style. He had started paying more attention to his appearance, changed his cologne, and joined a gym. Sophie would have been happy about such changes in the past. They had almost stopped making love. Jacob always found excuses. He was tired, had a lot of work, or had a headache. And when it happened, he seemed to rush to finish, avoiding looking her in the eyes. A new password appeared on his phone. Sophie noticed it by accident when he asked her to check the time of a meeting in his calendar. They used to have no secrets from each other. Now they did. The next evening, she stayed at work longer than usual. She dialed her husband's number. His phone was off. Sophie slowly gathered her things and left the office. In the elevator, she thought she heard a familiar laugh, a high-pitched female voice ringing with happiness. At home, she stood under the shower for a long time, letting the hot water wash away the tension of the day. She drew a heart on the steamy mirror as she used to do when leaving messages for Jacob before he left for work. He always responded in kind. When she came out of the bathroom, the mirror had been wiped clean. "Did something happen at work?" she asked at breakfast, noticing how her husband was nervously adjusting his shirt cuffs. "You seem tense lately." "Everything's fine." He finished his coffee and got up from the table. "Just a lot of projects right now. Don't wait up for me tonight. I have a late meeting." Sophie watched him hurry to get ready. A new tie, a fresh shirt, his hair carefully combed. There was a nervousness in his movements that hadn't been there before. He forgot to kiss her goodbye. That evening, she looked through old photos of her and Jacob in the park, on the beach, in their first apartment. In all the pictures, he looked at her with tenderness and adoration. When had that look changed? Sophie couldn't pinpoint the moment when things started to go wrong. In the bedroom, she noticed a long, dark hair on his pillow, clearly not hers. She carefully removed it and put it in an envelope. She didn't know why, maybe just as proof that she wasn't imagining things. At work, Sophie began to pay closer attention to the women in the sales department. Which one of them could have caught her husband's eye? The slender blonde from accounting, or the new girl on the third floor? She hated herself for these thoughts, but she couldn't shake them. Her phone vibrated. A message from Jacob. "I'll be late again tonight." Sophie glanced at her watch. It was 6:30. Lately, this message had been coming more and more often. She opened her calendar. It was their wedding anniversary in a week. I wonder if he remembers. The conference room was buzzing with voices. It was the last meeting before the company party. Sophie stood at the projector showing the seating plan. The event promised to be the largest in the company's history. The merger with a European partner required a special approach. "We'll put the buffet tables on the upper terrace," she said, zooming in on the plan. "The main action will take place in the main hall. The fountain will be illuminated and will become the focal point of the composition." Abigail diligently wrote down every word. Sophie glanced at her watch. There were only 3 days left until the event. Every little thing had to be checked, every detail. Too much depended on the success of this evening. In the far corner of the room, she noticed Melissa Harper listening intently and taking notes in her notebook. Jacob was sitting next to her, and Sophie thought they exchanged quick glances. She shook her head, dismissing the unwelcome thoughts. She needed to focus on her work now. After the meeting, Sophie went to check the venue. The banquet hall at the Royal Plaza Hotel was gradually being transformed. Workers were installing lighting equipment, florists were discussing arrangements. She adjusted the bow on one of the chairs. It had slipped slightly. "Miss Wilson, the chef would like you to approve the final menu." The hotel manager handed her a folder with documents. Sophie immersed herself in studying the list of dishes while answering calls and messages. In the evening, she checked the guest list. More than 300 people, including foreign partners and potential investors. Everyone needed attention and to be seated correctly. She noted that Melissa Harper was seated at the same table as the sales department management. At home, Jacob tried on his new suit, dark gray, perfectly tailored. "What do you think?" he asked his wife. Sophie nodded. The suit really was nice. "I wonder who he's trying so hard for." The next day, she met with the team of decorators. They discussed every detail, from the shade of the tablecloths to the placement of the lamps. Sophie insisted on a certain type of candle for the centerpieces. They had to burn all evening without melting. The office was buzzing with pre-holiday excitement. The female employees discussed their outfits, while the men arranged who would be driving. Sophie overheard Melissa telling her colleagues about her new dress, dark blue with an open back. The rehearsal for the official part took all morning. Sophie went over every moment of the program with the host. Jacob was supposed to give a presentation on the quarterly results, and she noticed how nervous he was, adjusting his shirt cuffs. By evening, the sound equipment was being set up. Sophie personally checked the sound quality at every point in the hall. Technicians adjusted the microphones and the DJ tested the system. She recorded all her comments on a voice recorder. She would have to double-check everything tomorrow. At the hairdresser's, she chose an elegant but understated hairstyle. The stylist suggested something more dramatic, but Sophie declined. She didn't want to attract unnecessary attention. Her job was to ensure that the event ran smoothly. She hardly slept the night before the party. She went over her to-do list in her head and checked her phone. Jacob had been asleep for a long time, his back turned to her. The sounds of the city at night drifted in through the half-open window. The morning began with a call from the florists. There was a problem with the delivery of orchids for the centerpiece. Sophie quickly found a replacement. White calla lilies looked just as good. She was used to solving such problems on the fly. The hotel was bustling with pleasant activity. Waiters were setting out glasses. Bartenders were preparing cocktail stations. Sophie checked the cloakroom and the guest navigation system. Every detail had to be perfect. Her evening gown, long and ivory, was already waiting for her at home. Sophie had chosen it for its elegant simplicity. No flashy details, just impeccable tailoring and quality fabric. She took a pearl necklace out of the safe, a gift from Jacob for their last anniversary. By 5 o'clock in the evening, everything was ready. Sophie made one last tour of the hall, checking every detail. The fountain murmured quietly, creating a soothing background. The evening lights of the Royal Plaza Hotel were reflected in the polished windows of the arriving cars. The lobby gradually filled with guests, ladies in evening gowns, men in formal suits. Live music created the right atmosphere. Sophie greeted the arrivals at the entrance to the main hall. She mechanically noted the details, the impeccable hairstyles, the new earrings, the barely noticeable tremor in the fingers as she adjusted her pearl necklace. Jacob was somewhere in the crowd talking to colleagues. She could hear his laughter but did not turn around. "What a stunning evening, Sophie." Henry Foster stopped next to her with a glass of champagne. "You've outdone yourself." She nodded gratefully, noting to herself that the lighting above the fountain had shifted slightly. She would have to tell the technicians. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Melissa's arrival. The dark blue dress really showed off her back, and the high slit emphasized her slender legs. Sophie felt her fingers tighten around the glass of mineral water. Waiters glided between the guests with trays of appetizers. Sophie signaled to the maitre d'. It was time to start serving the hot dishes. She habitually supervised the process while engaging in small talk with her business partners. At one point, she found herself near a group of sales department employees. Melissa was talking animatedly, throwing her head back dramatically. Jacob was standing a little to the side, but Sophie could see his gaze returning again and again to the graceful figure in blue. The official part of the event began. Sophie stepped onto a small stage to give a welcome speech. The spotlight blinded her for a moment. When her eyes adjusted, she noticed that Melissa and Jacob were standing next to each other, so close that their shoulders were almost touching. After the company president's speech, the dancing began. Sophie watched the room, noting that everything was going according to plan. The fountain created a pleasant coolness, and the play of light in the water jets mesmerized the guests. Jacob asked her to dance, a mandatory part of the protocol. His hand on her waist felt foreign. They moved perfectly in time to the music, but Sophie could feel her husband stealing glances over her shoulder. Melissa was dancing with one of the investors at that moment. Her movements were graceful and slightly provocative. Her dark hair cascaded over her bare shoulders, and her eyes sparkled mischievously. Sophie noticed several men following her with their eyes. The evening was in full swing. Toasts were made, glasses clinked, and waiters served dessert. Sophie moved from group to group, keeping up the conversation, solving minor problems, and monitoring the mood of the guests. At one point, she lost sight of both her husband and Melissa. Her heart sank, but her work demanded her attention. A delegation from the European office had arrived, and she had to greet the guests personally. Additional lights lit up above the fountain. The second part of the program was about to begin. Sophie stood by a column, watching the proceedings. Her flawless ivory dress seemed to glow in the shimmering reflections of the water. Sophie adjusted a stray strand of hair, looking in the mirror in the ladies' room. The evening was going according to plan. The guests were happy, and she tried not to think about how Jacob had held Melissa's elbow, helping her to sit down at the table. Returning to the hall, she heard muffled voices coming from the corridor leading to the staff quarters. Sophie slowed her pace when she recognized her husband's voice. "Everyone's watching," he whispered, barely audibly. "We need to be more careful." "Let them watch," Melissa said with a laugh. "I'm tired of hiding. And anyway, what does it matter? Your wife is too busy with her precious event to notice anything." Sophie froze, feeling her fingertips go numb. The music from the hall sounded like it was coming through cotton wool. She looked down at her shoes, perfectly matched to her dress, and couldn't bring herself to move. "Baby, not now," Jacob's voice took on a pleading tone. "There are important clients here, investors." "Exactly," Melissa lowered her voice. "And they all need to know who is really worthy of being by your side. That gray mouse." The sound of approaching footsteps made them fall silent. Sophie snapped out of her trance and quickly headed in the opposite direction, toward the main hall. Her gait remained steady. Years of work had taught her to keep her composure in any situation. The next hour passed in a blur. She mechanically performed her duties, smiling at guests, supervising the staff, giving instructions to the host. All the while, she could feel Melissa's triumphant gaze on her. The fountain murmured soothingly, colorful jets of water creating intricate patterns. Sophie was standing nearby, chatting with the wife of one of the investors, when she heard a familiar laugh behind her. "Oh, Sophie dear," Melissa's voice sounded exaggeratedly cheerful. "What a wonderful evening. You've worked so hard. Everything is so perfect." Sophie slowly turned around. Melissa was standing very close, swaying a glass of champagne. A necklace glinted in the neckline of her dress. Sophie recognized the jewelry she had seen in a jewelry store catalog. Jacob had bought it a month ago, supposedly for his mother. "You know," Melissa took a step closer, "I keep thinking, what's it like to live such a dull life? Everything on schedule, everything under control, no passion, no risk." "Melissa." Sophie heard her husband's warning voice, but it was too late. "Poor Jacob," Melissa sighed dramatically. "He deserves better than a woman obsessed with her lists and schedules. He needs a real—" She didn't have time to finish. Lurching as if by accident, Melissa pushed Sophie. Taken by surprise, Sophie lost her balance. In an instant, the icy water from the fountain crashed down on her. The music stopped. In the silence that followed, she could hear the drops of water falling from her soaked dress. Sophie slowly got up, feeling the heavy fabric clinging to her body. Her makeup was smeared, her hairstyle ruined. "Oh, I'm sorry." Melissa's feigned regret was replaced by poorly concealed triumph. "I'm so clumsy. Jacob, honey, help your wife." But Jacob stood motionless, looking past Sophie. His eyes showed not concern, but annoyance. She had ruined his perfect evening with her ridiculous fall. Someone handed her a towel. Someone else offered to call a taxi. Sophie saw the sympathetic glances of the guests and heard their hushed whispers. Melissa clung to Jacob and demonstratively dabbed his jacket with a napkin, pretending that it had been splashed. "I think I'd better leave." Sophie's voice sounded surprisingly calm. "Abigail will see to the rest of the program." She walked across the hall, leaving wet footprints behind her. Drops of water fell from the hem of her dress and strands of her hair, but her back remained straight. She would not give Melissa the satisfaction of seeing her broken. In the taxi, soaking the leather seat with moisture, Sophie allowed herself to breathe deeply for the first time that evening. Her hands were shaking, but it was not the tremor of despair. Somewhere deep inside, a cold, calculating rage was beginning to flare up. At home, she stood under the hot shower for a long time, as if trying to wash away not only the water from the fountain, but also the stares, the whispers, and her own humiliation. Then she took out her laptop and opened her contact list. She had many friends in different circles, many friends. The morning began with a buzzing silence in the office. Sophie walked down the hallway, feeling the stares of her colleagues on her. Her heels tapped out a steady rhythm on the marble floor, and her back was unnaturally straight, like a ballerina before she goes on stage. Abigail met her at the office door with a cup of freshly brewed coffee and a stack of reports from yesterday's event. Her eyes betrayed her concern, but she knew her boss well enough not to bring up what had happened. "Our European partners were satisfied," she said briskly. "They particularly praised the organization." The phone rang in the reception area. Sophie heard Abigail politely answering the calls. Journalists from business publications were trying to get comments on the scandal at the event. Rumors spread quickly. Through the glass partitions of the office, she could see employees gathering in small groups, talking in hushed voices. When she appeared, the conversations died down and everyone looked down at their computer screens. An awkward silence hung in the cafeteria at lunchtime when she entered. Sophie calmly took her usual salad and sat down at a table by the window. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed two girls from accounting hurriedly gathering their trays and moving away. "May I?" Martha, the company's chief lawyer, sounded unusually soft. Sophie nodded, and the woman sat down in the chair opposite her. They talked about the weather, new amendments to tax legislation, anything but last night. But there was support in this silent presence. After lunch, Sophie noticed the cleaning lady, Rosa, cross herself furtively when she saw her. The elderly woman's eyes showed sincere sympathy. She whispered something in Spanish, a prayer, it seemed. The sales department was unusually lively. Sophie had to go in to sign some documents. Melissa was sitting at her desk, surrounded by the admiring glances of her junior colleagues. A faint, smug smile played on her lips. Jacob was absent, supposedly at a meeting with clients. His empty desk looked unusually tidy. Passing by, Sophie noticed a framed photograph of the two of them in front of the Eiffel Tower. The picture was taken on their honeymoon. By the end of the day, office gossip had already formed a certain version of events. Supposedly, Sophie was to blame. She had devoted too much attention to her work and neglected her family life. Melissa, young, vibrant, and lively, simply couldn't resist Jacob's charisma. In the ladies' room, Sophie overheard a conversation between two interns. "She's so cold," said one. "No wonder her husband." Seeing Sophie's reflection in the mirror, the girls fell silent in fright and rushed out of the room. Henry Foster stopped her in the hallway. "Excellent work yesterday," he said in an official tone. "The Europeans are impressed with the level of organization." His gaze spoke louder than words. He always valued professionalism over office politics. In the evening, Sharon from HR stopped by the office, ostensibly to discuss the next team-building program. But her eyes betrayed her professional interest. Situations like this often ended with resignation letters or demands for compensation. Abigail brought another stack of documents for signing. "Maybe we could go for a coffee after work," she suggested cautiously. Sophie shook her head. She needed to keep her distance. Right now, any sign of weakness could be used against her. At the end of the day, she noticed Melissa leaving the HR director's office. The girl walked with confidence, holding some papers in her hands. Passing Sophie's desk, she accidentally dropped one sheet, a promotion order. The security guard in the lobby looked at Sophie with poorly concealed curiosity as she left the building. She knew that tomorrow the office would be discussing every detail of her behavior, how she carried herself, what she said, what expression she had on her face when she met Melissa. In the car, she allowed herself a few minutes of silence. The events of the day flashed before her eyes, the glances, the whispers, the awkward pauses in conversation. But somewhere behind this veil of sympathy and condemnation, she could discern something else. Those who were not rushing to conclusions, who remembered her professionalism and integrity. Her phone vibrated quietly, a message from Martha. "Come by tomorrow. We need to discuss a contract." Sophie smiled faintly. The head of the legal department was famous for her ability to find loopholes in the most complicated situations. At home, she slowly unpacked her bag and neatly stacked the documents on the table. Tomorrow would be a new day, and she would greet it just as she had greeted today, with her back straight and her head held high. After all, she had always been good at long-term planning. The steady tapping of keys filled the apartment in the early hours of the morning. Sophie sat at her laptop, methodically browsing social media profiles. Melissa Harper's page was full of photos, trendy restaurants, expensive resorts, social events. Under each photo were dozens of enthusiastic comments. A cup of cold coffee stood nearby as Sophie delved deeper into her rival's digital footprint. University in Chicago, a job at a prestigious company, a sudden move to their city. Something didn't add up in this perfect picture. The doorbell rang. Martha had brought the promised documents. The head of the legal department settled into her chair and took out her laptop. "I dug up some old connections in Chicago," she said quietly, even though they were alone in the apartment. "An interesting story has come to light." Scanned documents appeared on the screen, a court case that had been settled out of court. Melissa's name appeared as the defendant. The case involved corporate espionage and disclosure of confidential information. Sophie's phone vibrated quietly, a message from an old friend who worked at a large recruitment agency. "Stop by my office at lunchtime. I have some information that will interest you." In a cozy cafe near the office, her friend handed her a thin folder. "This is unofficial," she warned, "but your Melissa has left her mark on several companies. It's the same pattern everywhere, an affair with management, an attempt to get promoted, a scandal." Sophie slowly sipped her green tea, analyzing the information she had received. The story was repeating itself. Melissa found a successful married man, charmed him, got a promotion, and then it all ended with a loud dismissal. In the evening, she met with Rosa, an elderly cleaning lady. Over a cup of herbal tea, the woman told her about the conversation she had overheard in the office corridors. She was bragging to the girls. Rosa shook her head. She said she would soon be getting a high position. That night, Sophie methodically sorted the information into folders on her computer. Every document, every detail could be useful. She was used to meticulous planning. Now those skills would come in handy for another purpose. The next day, she accidentally bumped into the HR director's secretary in the elevator. The conversation about new shoes imperceptibly turned to a discussion of personnel changes. It turned out that Melissa had already applied for a promotion. During her lunch break, Sophie browsed through business publications. Her attention was drawn to an article about the expansion of a competing company. They were looking for experienced customer service specialists. She made a note in her diary. Abigail brought the latest gossip from the sales department. Melissa was already openly talking about upcoming changes in her career, hinting at a special relationship with management. A photo of her in an elegant silver frame appeared on Jacob's desk. That evening, Sophie met up with an old college friend who worked in IT. Over a glass of wine, they discussed technical details, how to access old emails, how to track digital footprints, how to find deleted information. On Friday, she had lunch with Henry Foster, ostensibly to discuss a new project. The conversation smoothly turned to the topic of career growth for young employees. "Ambition is good," he remarked, "but reputation in business is more valuable." At home, Sophie created a new folder on her computer called Project M. Inside, she created subfolders: documents, contacts, and schedule. She methodically filled them with information, building a complex plan for the upcoming operation. A call from a former colleague in Chicago brought new details. The corporate espionage story turned out to be more serious than expected. Melissa had avoided prosecution only thanks to her influential connections. On Saturday, Sophie met with a private investigator, an old acquaintance of Martha's. He listened to her carefully and named his price. It was a lot of money, but she didn't haggle. Quality information was worth the cost. She spent Sunday analyzing the data she had gathered. An interesting picture was emerging. Behind Melissa's glamorous exterior lay a string of scandals and ruined careers. Now she had to find a way to use this information. Late in the evening, she received a message from a friend at a recruitment agency. "I'm meeting an important client tomorrow. I think they have an interesting vacancy." Sophie smiled. The plan was beginning to take shape. She was used to organizing perfect events, where every detail worked toward the overall result. This project would be no exception. Dusk was falling outside the windows of the fashionable restaurant Le Chateau. Sophie adjusted her pearl necklace and looked intently at her companion, Victoria Price, the head of a large recruitment agency. "So, you need a plausible job opening." Victoria sipped her wine. Something attractive enough that an ambitious young woman would jump at without hesitation. The waiter brought the oysters. Sophie slowly squeezed lemon juice onto the shellfish, carefully choosing her words. Deputy Director of Development, a young, promising company, an office in the city center, and a salary 30% above market rate. Victoria nodded knowingly. In her 20 years in recruitment, she had seen her fair share of corporate intrigue. "We need to create the right background information," she said, taking out her smartphone and starting to take notes. The next day, several business publications ran articles about Blue Star Innovations, a supposedly new player in the technology market. The articles were written convincingly enough to pique interest, but not in enough detail to raise unnecessary questions. The phone rang in the office. "Miss Harper?" The recruiter's voice sounded professional and interested. "I have an offer that might interest you. Confidential, of course." Sophie watched through the glass partition as Melissa, with the phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, hurriedly jotted something down in her notebook. A familiar smug smile appeared on the girl's face. In the evening, a small group gathered at the Blue Oyster Bar, a supposedly chance meeting of former colleagues. Among them was Sarah, who worked at Blue Star Innovations. Her stories about corporate culture and growth opportunities sounded particularly convincing after the third glass of wine. "Can you imagine," Abigail shared the next day, "Melissa has been studying information about some innovative projects all morning. They say she's been offered a management position at a promising company." The Blue Star office was located in a prestigious business center. Temporary, of course. The rent was paid for a month. But Melissa, sitting in a spacious office with a view of the city, didn't know that. "We're looking for ambitious people," said the gray-haired man who introduced himself as the director of development. "Your resume impressed us, especially your experience in Chicago." Sophie was sitting in a cafe across from the business center when Melissa came out after her interview. She walked with a spring in her step and a triumphant smile on her lips. She was holding a folder with the Blue Star logo. That evening, the sales department bar was abuzz with talk of Melissa's impending departure. She made no secret of her triumph, talking about the fantastic conditions and career prospects. "Sophie?" Victoria's voice sounded businesslike on the phone. "Everything is going according to plan. She took the bait. She'll get the official offer tomorrow." In her office, Sophie methodically laid out the documents. Every detail had been thought out, from fake business cards to a fake company website. She was used to organizing flawless events, and this project was no exception. The recruiter called Melissa back in the evening. "The board of directors has approved your candidacy," he said. "But there's one condition. You have to start within a week. The competition is fierce." On Friday, Melissa placed her resignation letter on Henry Foster's desk. Her farewell speech was full of poorly concealed triumph. She spoke of new horizons and great achievements, glancing sideways at Jacob. Sophie watched the scene from afar, slowly sipping coffee from her favorite mug. She knew that in exactly 1 week, the Blue Star office would be empty and the phones would stop ringing. But that would be another story. "Are you sure you've thought this through?" Martha asked over dinner at a small restaurant. Sophie nodded, watching the light dance in her glass of red wine. The morning of her last day at work was cool. Melissa entered the Sterling Industries office, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Her gait exuded superiority. No wonder, since tomorrow she would be taking the seat of deputy director at a promising company. "Ah, she's still here," she said loudly as she passed Sophie's desk. An awkward silence hung in the reception area. Abigail pointedly stared at her monitor, but her fingers froze over the keyboard. Jacob hadn't been in the office for a week. He had left for important negotiations in another city. No one had seen him since the company party. Even Sophie didn't know where he was. His phone was off, and his things had disappeared from his apartment while she was at work. In the sales department, Melissa was packing her things, commenting on the company's corporate policy as she went. Her voice grew louder. She wanted everyone to hear how she was finally getting out of this mess. "They stifle any initiative here," she said, putting photos and trinkets into a box. "Promotions are only given to those with connections or for special services to management. At Blue Star, they value talent and ambition." Henry Foster called her in for a final conversation. Melissa entered the office with her head held high but left visibly annoyed. Apparently her boss did not appreciate her farewell speech about the incompetence of the management. By lunchtime, she was openly calling the sales director an old senile fool and the HR department a bunch of incompetents. Her co-workers tried to stay away from her desk, but they eagerly caught every word. Tomorrow it would be the main topic of office gossip. Her phone vibrated in her purse. Another message from Jacob went unanswered. She had been deliberately ignoring his calls for the last few days. Let him suffer, imagining her in her new status. After lunch, Melissa held a small press conference right in the office kitchen. She spoke passionately about the company's problems, not mincing her words. The management system and corporate ethics came in for particular criticism. "And that upstart Sophie," her voice dripping with venom, "is a typical example of how rotten everything is here. She's a completely useless employee, but she's hanging on because of her connections. Although what connections does she have now? Even her husband ran away." At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she staged a showy farewell to her colleagues. Everyone got a dose of sincere wishes to find a better job. Some turned away demonstratively, but most just watched the spectacle in silence. "I hope you all realize soon what a toxic atmosphere there is here," she said, standing in the middle of the open space. "Blue Star is on a whole other level. They value professionals there, not hangers-on." By the end of the workday, Melissa was in full swing. She actively wrote scathing posts in the corporate chat, naming specific people and amounts. She was particularly outraged by the crazy spending on corporate events. Gathering her last belongings, she made a dramatic exit, her heels clicking loudly as she crossed the office. At the door, she paused, looked around at everyone with contempt, and announced loudly, "Enjoy your swamp. I'm off to pasture." In the bar across from the office, she celebrated her liberation with several young employees. Champagne flowed freely, and Melissa talked and talked about her plans, her future projects, how she would transform Blue Star. Her phone vibrated again. This time she read Jacob's message. "I can't get through. We need to talk." Melissa smiled and sent a photo of her badge with the Blue Star logo and her new job title in reply. Sophie watched the scene from the far corner of the bar. She sipped her mineral water leisurely while Victoria told her the latest news. Tomorrow, the Blue Star office would greet Melissa with locked doors and disconnected phones. The luxurious office center greeted Melissa with silence. She adjusted her new silk scarf and confidently headed for the elevators, pulling out the pass she had been given last week. The card didn't work. "Excuse me, there must be some mistake." She smiled at the security guard with her trademark smile. "I'm the new deputy director of Blue Star. Today is my first day." The security guard looked puzzled at his logbook. "There's no such company in this building. Maybe you got the wrong address?" Melissa felt the ground slip away from under her feet. With trembling fingers, she dialed Rachel's number. Subscriber unavailable. The director's phone was silent, and emails bounced back with the message, "Address does not exist." In a panic, she started calling everyone she knew at Blue Star. No one answered. The company's website wouldn't load, and its social media pages had disappeared. It was as if it had all been a mirage, melting away in the morning fog. With trembling hands, she took out her phone and dialed Jacob's number. After the third ring, he picked up. "Jake, you won't believe what's happening." Her voice broke into a scream. "That damn company. It doesn't exist. I'm out of a job." There was a heavy pause on the line. "I know," Jacob finally said. "They sent me the documents. All your antics at Sterling, the Chicago thing, the other companies. Sophie organized this investigation." Melissa sank down onto the steps of the business center. Her expensive shoes twisted awkwardly, her tights caught on the rough stone. "But how? Why? Did you really think you could humiliate my wife and get away with it?" His voice was cold. "You know, I deserved all this. But Sophie, she didn't deserve this." "Honey, Melissa began, but Jacob cut her off. "There is no we anymore. I'm flying to the Seattle branch. I've already written my transfer request. And I don't advise you to look for a job in this city. Sophie has sent your past employment records to all the major employers." The connection was cut off. Melissa sat on the cold steps, watching people pass by. They hurried about their business, no one paying attention to the elegant woman in an expensive suit, silently crying at the entrance to the business center. Her phone was ringing off the hook. Her former colleagues had already heard the news. The first comments about her high-profile dismissal and the non-existent company appeared on social media. The reputation she had so carefully built was collapsing like a house of cards. Her second phone, the one she used for personal calls, vibrated in her purse. A message from Sophie. "Just so you know, the water in the fountain didn't ruin my dress too badly. Have a good day." Melissa closed her eyes. Somewhere above, the gray autumn sky was reflected in the mirrored windows of the business center. It was as gray as her future in this city. Sophie was sitting in the dark living room when she heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. She didn't turn on the lights. The moonlight and the reflections from the streetlights cast strange shadows on the walls. Jacob froze in the doorway when he saw her silhouette in the chair. A travel bag hung over his shoulder, the same one he usually took on business trips. Only now it was clearly packed in a hurry, with items sticking out of the open zipper. "I thought you were asleep." His voice sounded hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. Sophie didn't answer, continuing to watch the shadows dance on the wall. He walked into the kitchen and flipped the light switch. The bright light hurt her eyes. Sophie heard him open the refrigerator and take out a bottle of water. The familiar sounds of home now seemed strange and out of place. "Where were you?" Her question sounded casual, as if she were asking about the weather. Jacob froze with the bottle in his hand. "At the hotel. I needed to think," he said, sitting down in a chair without looking at his wife. "I got the documents, about Melissa and about the fake company." Sophie finally turned to him. In the dim light of the kitchen lamp, his face looked haggard. Stubble was visible on his cheeks and his shirt collar was rumpled. "You know what's funny?" She spoke quietly, but each word fell like a stone. "I really didn't know. Not until that evening. Not until the fountain." Jacob ran his hand over his face, a gesture she knew by heart. He always did that when he felt guilty. "I didn't want it to turn out like this," he began, but Sophie interrupted him. "You didn't want it to." Her laughter sounded unexpectedly loud in the night silence. "What did you want, Jacob? For me to keep organizing company parties while you had fun with your young mistress?" He was silent, twirling the bottle in his hands. The water inside sloshed quietly, creating a strange accompaniment to their conversation. "You have no idea what it's like to stand there, wet, in front of everyone." Sophie stood up and walked over to the window. "And you just stood there watching. You didn't even come over." I was confused. His voice sounded hollow. "It all happened so fast." "Confused?" She turned to him. "No, dear. You weren't confused. You just chose sides, just like you've been doing for the past few months." A heavy silence hung in the kitchen. A car drove by outside, its headlights briefly illuminating the room. "I've applied for a transfer," Jacob finally said, "to the Seattle branch. I think it'll be better for everyone." Sophie looked at his hands, familiar down to the last wrinkle. These hands had once wiped away her tears, hugged her in the mornings, given her flowers. Now they fidgeted nervously with a water bottle, unable to find peace. "You know what's the worst part?" she said, her voice now very quiet. "I don't even feel any pain, just emptiness, and maybe a little pity, for you." Jacob looked up. "Pity?" "Yes," Sophie said, walking over to the table and sitting down across from him. "Because you still don't understand the main thing. I didn't organize this whole Blue Star thing out of revenge. It's because people like Melissa should get what they deserve. She used you like she used others before you, and you were just another step on her career ladder." "You're wrong," he tried to argue, but there was no conviction in his voice. What do you mean, really?" Sophie smiled, and the smile made him feel uncomfortable. "Did you love each other? Did you make plans? She was already looking for a new job without even telling you. She was ready to leave without even looking back." Jacob was silent. In the silence, he could hear the ticking of the clock, an old one they had bought on their first trip to Europe together. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he finally said. "I'll pick up my things later." Sophie nodded. "Leave the keys on the table." Later, lying in the dark, Sophie listened to him packing his things in his study. Every sound echoed in the emptiness of their once shared home. The front door closed quietly around 3 in the morning. At dawn, she got up, took a shower, and started getting ready for work. There was an empty space in the closet next to her clothes. Jacob had taken his suits. His aftershave was still on the bathroom shelf. Had he forgotten it in his rush or left it there on purpose? As she left, she noticed a set of keys and an envelope on the table. Inside was a note. "I'm sorry. For everything." Sophie carefully folded the paper and threw it in the trash can. A taxi was waiting for her at the entrance. A new day required new decisions. 6 months later, Marco's restaurant was buzzing with the evening rush. Sophie was sitting at her favorite table by the window when she noticed a familiar figure behind the bar. Melissa had changed a lot. The expensive jewelry was gone, her makeup was more modest, and her movements had taken on the busyness of a waitress. Their eyes met for a moment. Melissa immediately turned away, pretending to wipe the glasses. Her hands were trembling slightly. "Your favorite table is free." Martha sat down opposite her, dabbing her rain-soaked hair with a napkin. The head of the legal department at Sterling Industries now often kept Sophie company at dinner. Funny. Sophie sipped her wine. She used to only order truffle dishes here. Now she's serving them to others. Martha shook her head. "After your memo, she can't even get an administrative job. They say she tried to get work in 3 cities, but her reputation precedes her." In the far corner of the room, a young couple was celebrating their engagement. The girl kept admiring her ring, and her companion couldn't take his eyes off her. Sophie caught herself thinking that she felt neither bitterness nor regret. "The director approved your project." Martha opened the menu. "Now you'll be in charge of all the network's events. You'll have to travel a lot." Sophie smiled. After the scandal with Melissa, her authority in the company had only grown. Everyone knew she wasn't just an event planner, she was a strategist capable of calculating any combination. A message came in from Abigail, a photo from the opening of a new branch in Seattle. Somewhere in the background, she could make out Jacob. He looked older and tired. "You know," Martha put down the menu, "you could have destroyed them both, but you stopped halfway. Why?" Sophie looked out the window. Raindrops ran down the glass, blurring the lights of the evening city. "Revenge isn't about destruction," she said thoughtfully, swirling her glass. "It's about restoring justice." Melissa flitted past their table, hurriedly carrying a tray of desserts. Her once perfect posture was slumped, and early gray hairs had appeared in her dark hair. "What about Jacob?" Martha called over a waiter, but not Melissa, a different one. "He made his choice," Sophie shrugged, "and he got what he deserved, a life knowing how stupid he was. I think that's punishment enough." A group of young people at the next table were laughing. One of them was trying to get Melissa's attention, but she was carefully avoiding that part of the room. "I've been asked to join the board of directors," Sophie remarked casually. "Can you imagine? The first woman in the company's history." Martha smiled. "They finally realized that people like you aren't to be trifled with, especially after you saved the company's reputation during the merger." Live music began to play in the hall. A couple celebrating their engagement took to the dance floor. They moved awkwardly, but they looked so happy that no one noticed their lack of rhythm. Sophie took her lipstick out of her purse. The small mirror reflected a confident woman with a slight smile on her lips. There was no trace of the confused, fountain-splashed figure that had stood in the middle of the banquet hall 6 months ago. "By the way," Martha lowered her voice, "did you hear? That British investor who was at the merger, he asked about you." "Really?" Sophie hid a smile behind her wineglass. "Wow, I thought he was only interested in the numbers in the reports." Outside, the rain gradually subsided. The city lit up with evening lights and the restaurant became more and more lively. Melissa walked past their table again, her head bowed low. "You know what's funny?" Sophie followed her with her eyes. She never understood the main thing. You can't build happiness on someone else's misfortune. Sooner or later, it all comes back. Martha raised her glass. "To justice?" "To new beginnings," Sophie smiled, and a familiar sparkle flashed in her eyes. the same sparkle that had once captivated Jacob and now made the directors respect her opinion. A taxi was waiting for them outside. Tomorrow was an important day, the presentation of a new project to the board of directors, and Sophie knew for sure that it would be a flawless event, just like everything else she had ever done in her life.